Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Barry. It's a great pleasure to have you at my channel tonight.
My pleasure to be here. I'm glad we got the technology solved.
Yes.
Just in time.
Yeah. So it's actually the first time that we talk directly, each one to the other.
It is.
So, yeah. So I don't want to lose much time. I would like to go right away to my first question. Maybe you can introduce
Okay, now you've frozen on me. Well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself because I believe that's what you're asking me to do, but you are currently frozen at the moment in the screen. My name is Barrie Schwortz. I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, the team that performed the first in-depth scientific examination of the shroud in its history back in 1978. I was the official documenting photographer, so my responsibility was primarily to document what the team did and document each of the experiments. And I was also responsible for documenting each test point that each researcher took on the shroud, from which I then created a series of maps, which are, of course, available now on shroud.com. Now, I'm not sure if we're having technical difficulties still. I don't know if you can hear me, Otanzelo. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. I'm with the other phone now, so let's continue.
Well, not I can hear you again. I introduced myself because I believe that's what you were asking me when you froze.
Okay, so I missed that one, but let's continue. I will rewatch it afterwards. So I did read that in '95 you came to believe that the shroud is authentic. Can you a little bit tell us how you came to that conclusion?
Sure. First of all, people should know that I'm Jewish. So when I was first asked to be on the team, I said no. I didn't think I should be involved with it. But then I was reminded that the man in question was also Jewish, so it was appropriate for me to be there. And most importantly, that it was a scientific expedition, if you will, and not necessarily anything to do with religion or theology, which is not my field of expertise. So my involvement came, as I said, as a member of that team, but I was not convinced. I was a total skeptic from the beginning and felt that it was probably some kind of artwork. And actually, when we first had the shroud put before us, I immediately started looking for paint or pigment because I had foolishly said that, we'll get there and we'll take a look and we'll see the paint and we'll come home. That'll be it. Well, of course, that's not what happened. And but for many years, there were still some unanswered questions that, even though the science was very convincing, I was not fully convinced until 1995. And that's when I had a conversation with Dr. Alan Adler, also on our team, a blood chemist and also Jewish. And so I spoke with Alan. He gave me his explanation for why the blood on the shroud remained reddish in color, because old blood normally turns brown or black. Well, I trusted Adler. He was a blood chemist, and I'm a photographer, so his word was far more important to me. And that was really sort of the last piece of the puzzle for me. Now, since then, other data has shown that there might be other reasons than the reason Adler gave me for the blood being red. But at that moment in time, 1995, that was sufficient of an answer to convince me, based really solely on the science itself, that the shroud was most likely authentic. And ironically, just a few weeks, maybe even a week or two later, I got a phone call from a friend who said, that shroud thing you're involved with, Well, it turns out that that's just a photo made by Leonardo da Vinci. And I laughed because I thought he was joking. And he wasn't joking at all. He was very sincere about it. And I said, where are you getting your information? Remember, I had access to all the scientific work, all the papers, everything that had been published. And he told me that he and his wife were checking out at the grocery store. Well, here in the United States, that's where all the tabloids are sold. I'm not sure how it is in Brazil, but probably a similar thing.
Uh-huh.
And consequently, it occurred to me at that moment that I was privileged, that I had access to all this science, and it was that convinced me of the authenticity. And so while I was still on the phone with him, I wrote a note on the manila folder on my desk, and the note was 4 words: consider building a website. This was 1995. And that was what prompted me to build shroud.com. And next January, this coming January, we'll celebrate our 25th anniversary on the internet. People often make a big deal about our being #1 organic search on Google and Bing and all the others. And I have to remind people that we're 2 years older than Google. Google came around 1998, and we were already 2 years old at the time. So it was that last piece of science from Al Adler, coupled with my realization that the public, the people to whom this piece of cloth has such important meaning, did not have access to what I had access to. And back in 1995, before the internet exploded, people didn't read scientific journals. The only access you could get to them was to go to some research library, university library, so that you could access these journals. Of course, now most of these journals are online. Sadly, some of the earlier versions of those journals have never been archived. So we've done that on shroud.com with all the scientific papers that our team produced, because some of the journals, although they were very high-powered journals, don't go back in their archives far enough for the papers that were published.
I see. So you said that since 95, there is coming up other evidence in regards of the blood strains on the shroud. Has that actually solidified the conclusion that it is actually blood from a tortured man, or what is the last scientific evidence or conclusion in regards of the blood strains?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that I have to be very candid with the answer here. Remember that in 1978 through 1981, the 3 years that our team was evaluating our work and publishing it into journals, technology was at a different level than it is today, especially blood and DNA analysis, which was a very new science in Dr. Adler's time, but much more refined and in depth today than it was then. So there are new tests that could be performed given the opportunity that could verify to a scientific certainty that the blood is human, that the blood is from a human being. Although the initial tests done by Adler point in that direction, if we want to be honest scientifically, some new testing should be performed that could hopefully verify that completely and put that aside as a potential question, particularly from skeptics.
Okay, so I don't know in where that I did find information that you were a Christian. Then in our contact, in our email exchange, you corrected me and said, no, I'm not a Christian. So
Yeah.
it took me by surprise a little bit, because I thought, oh, well, if Barrie is convinced that the shroud is not a forgery or something like that, then of course he must also believe that it is a supernatural image, that we don't have any explanation whatsoever how the shroud got that image.
Well,
And if he believes that the image is really an image of Christ, so how does he not believe that Christ is the one that he says he is? So if you can maybe clarify that.
Sure. No, first of all, I get that question frequently. Second of all, I think because I did presentation, a TED Talk at the Vatican, the first ever done at the Vatican. I was one of the participants. From that article, I think people somehow, at least some people, misinterpreted that I had become Christian, which I have not. And the answer to the question is this. Because my involvement with the Shroud began and continues to be primarily based on the science, that's what convinced me. The answer to your question is this. Only one set of in-depth examinations have ever been permitted on the Shroud. Until further research using more modern technology that we have available to us today, I am not yet prepared to set aside the possibility of a natural explanation for the image on the Shroud. And because of that, I have not taken that step that so many of my Catholic and evangelical and Christian brothers and sisters would like me to take. But I always try and make people feel a little better because I get evangelized a lot. And so I always remind people that I didn't expect to be sitting here speaking with someone in Brazil about the Shroud of Turin. And so how do I know where I'll be tomorrow? So I always, to give some hope to people so they aren't too disappointed, I always remind them that they should relax because I'm not dead yet.
No, I understand that. And it is more out of curiosity. I will not line up with all these people who will try to convince you that Christ is the one that he said to be. It just, I ask because it is curious. That
it's a valid question. And by the way, no questions are off limits. You can ask anything. I'm not offended by personal questions. If, as I have over the last 25 years, if you take a public role with something as controversial as the Shroud of Turin, you have to expect people to ask questions, sometimes very personal questions. And I have nothing to hide. I've put all my cards on the table, as they say, and I have, spoken freely and truly from the heart that I am convinced that this is the cloth that wrapped the historic Jesus. That is not a commentary on whether or not he was the Messiah, that that all Christians believe, and even Messianic Jewish people believe that. I've even spoken at Messianic congregations, which is kind of interesting for me because it's a bunch of Jewish people that are all Christians, and it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of the two. So I'm not ever offended by these questions. And I think, considering that I've taken such a public role these last years, that it's important that I answer that question and give the honest answer. That's why, even when I lecture, I don't use a script. People go to sleep when you read to them, but when you speak to them from the heart, when you look them right in the eye and you speak to them from the heart, they can tell the difference. So I always speak. I never have a prepared script for my presentations or my lectures. The only time there's that level of preparation, I teach a course at the Athenaeum, the Pontifical University in Rome, on the science of the Shroud and the STURP team. And of course, that's an academic course at the graduate level. So that's a much more academic presentation with footnotes and references, the kind of things that one would expect in an academic course. But my public lectures are much simpler, much more down to earth, and I can just be myself and speak freely the way I'm speaking to you now.
So when I put the link on Facebook about the Shroud, then many unbelievers and atheists, they always come up with the same objection. Oh, it's a forgery. It's from the 14th century. Radiocarbon dating has demonstrated that it's not 2,000 years old. So I would like to know from you, what evidence do we have that it's older than from the 14th century?
Well, first, let me address those people. It's a shame that the people who believe that it's a medieval forgery ignore all the peer-reviewed published science that proves it's not an artwork. Our team went there to determine how the image was formed. That was our primary goal. One of the most important things that we did was bring with us non-destructive tests that characterized that image on the cloth. And so from my point of view, we already know that it's not an artwork. There's no paint, pigment, or binder anywhere on that cloth that would be indicative of some painted image. One of the other theories was that it might have been a scorch, that somebody had this beautiful statue of Jesus that was made of metal, and they heated it and laid the shroud onto it to create a scorched image of the shroud. And look, I understand why people might think that, because the color of the image itself is very similar to the lightly scorched areas that are on the shroud. So to test that theory that the shroud might be a scorch, we used ultraviolet fluorescence photography. When you do that, you light it with a UV light source, and you have filtration over the camera, and you record that onto film. You're only recording the fluorescence caused by the UV source. And all of the scorches, which are documented from the 1532 fire on the shroud, all of the scorches fluoresced in the red. The background of the cloth itself fluoresced a sort of yellow-green. The image on the shroud did not fluoresce at all, and it actually quenched the fluorescence of the background. So if the shroud image were the product of a high temperature event, the image would have fluoresced in the red and we would have been finished. That would have been the end of it. The image did not fluoresce. The background did. The scorches all fluoresced red. Every documented scorch on the shroud showed that red fluorescence. So we could eliminate a high temperature event as one of the potential ways the shroud was made. And the other possibility was that it might have been made photographically. Well, that would require a light-sensitive material like silver. Salts of silver would be used and would have been known to turn dark in sunlight. So that would have been available in some respects in medieval times. So we tested that theory by looking for silver on the shroud. Now, if you understand the old analog photographic process, the image is created by the silver. The fixer that we soak our film and prints in afterwards removes the unused silver, and what remains as the image also has silver still in it. So we look for silver on the shroud. According to the experts who have done this experiment and consider themselves, I think it's an art historian from South Africa, Nicholas Allen, he actually took the time to create an emulsion, coated it onto a piece of cloth, photographed the statue for 4 days and nights to get the adequate exposure to make a visible image. And the problem is, if you compare that to the shroud, they're dramatically different. They're nothing, there's no similarities even close. They're dramatically different. And we found no silver anywhere on the shroud, except for one bead that was microscopic that may have come from the reliquary, the box that it was stored in when it was damaged in the fire in 1532. But that was a little microscopic bead of silver. If the cloth had been soaked in a silver emulsion, as Nicholas Allen proclaims, it would have permeated the cloth. We'd have found silver everywhere, and even more so in the image areas. We found no silver, and we even had pyrolysis mass spectrometry that could detect 1 part per billion of silver. We found none. So we eliminated all of those possibilities as the ability of the shroud. So to answer your question about the age, first of all, we've proven it's not an artwork. It was not manufactured or made by the hand of a man. It's not a photograph, and it's not a scorch. That pretty much eliminates all of those possibilities that those skeptics want to talk about. Now, what about early history of the shroud? Now, let's face it, it's quite obscure. But also remember what we're talking about. We're talking about a piece of cloth that breaks 2 Jewish laws right at the beginning. It contains blood of the decedent, and Jewish law requires that be buried with the body. That's why there was a second cloth mentioned in the Gospels, a separate cloth, folded and separate from the other. That would have been the face cloth that they put over his face when they brought him from the cross to the tomb. It had blood and pleural fluids on it. It still exists. It's in Spain. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. Mm-hmm. And that's even mentioned in the Gospels, that there was a second cloth folded and separate. Yes. When I read that passage in the New Testament, I looked at my friend who was sitting with me and I said, that's an authentic Jewish burial, because that cloth would have had to remain with the body to be buried with the body. So, is the shroud old enough? Well, think about this. In those first few centuries, particularly, there were iconoclasts looking to destroy any symbols of Christianity. And if they had come running out of the tomb saying, "Well, look what we found," there would have been an iconoclast handy quickly to try and destroy it. It had to be kept a secret. The second law of Jewish law it violates is that it bears the image, okay? And Jews are forbidden to have any depictions of God, as are Muslims to this day. And of course, we know about graven images. That's something that many of the skeptics always throw at me. Oh, it's a graven image. Well, we proved that it's not an artwork made by the hand of a man, and that's the definition of a graven image. And remember, the Jews had a golden calf that cost them 40 years in the desert. So we know what a graven image is. The shroud cannot be considered a graven image because we've proven scientifically that it's not manufactured by the hand of a man. So that means that what's left is either some natural mechanism that we yet to have become to understand, or something supernatural. And as I said a few minutes ago, until further testing is done using the most modern 21st century technology available, I'm not prepared to set aside the possibility of some natural explanation that may have caused the image. Beyond that, if there's no evidence to support that at some point in time, who knows where my heart might go. But as it stands right now, I represent the men who more than half have died, and I want to preserve their work and the hard work that they put in to do what they did. Such a tremendous thing. Remember, nobody had ever done anything like this before. So there was really no precedent for what we had to go and do. And of course, instead of working in a beautiful laboratory, which would have been really nice, we had to work in a 400-year-old palace with frescoes on the ceiling. And every time a big vehicle drove by the palace, the building would vibrate and you could see the dust falling. And so it wasn't the ideal circumstances, but it was what we were given and what we worked with. And we spent literally 5 days and nights working around the clock to collect this data. And remember, this is data taken directly from the shroud. Now, one of the typical things skeptics always throw at us, well, you were all biased. You were all a bunch of religious fanatics and you were all biased. Well, take a look at who these team members were. They represented Los Alamos National Laboratories and Sandia Laboratories, both weapons labs, one of them responsible for the atomic bomb. So these were not a bunch of religious fanatics. These were hardcore scientists. And so there was really, the skeptics like to throw, as a matter of fact, one of them wrote that all of our peer-reviewed science was the rantings of believers, which makes me laugh because there were 3 Jews, there was a Mormon, there were some atheists, there were some agnostics. And I've been criticized for not publishing the religious affiliations of our team members. Well, I don't know them because that was never a criteria for membership in the team. If it had been, if religious background was one of the criteria for being on that team, there would have been a different team than the one that went over there. It would not have been these same men. So when we talk about the age of the shroud and the history of the shroud, it is obscured. The first evidence of Jesus depicted the way the man of the shroud looks, split beard and the longer beard, was about 285 AD in the Domitia catacombs in Rome. And that's the first depiction of Jesus that looks like the man of the shroud. So that's 250 years after the event. Where was it for those first 250 years? Only God knows, because it was hidden away, probably to protect and preserve it. Might have even been forgotten at some point. We don't know. But it does come into play in the 4th and 5th, 6th centuries, all the icons of the Orthodox Church, the depictions of Jesus that all look like the man of the shroud, that have many similar characteristics in the artworks to the image itself on the shroud. So there are hints to its existence. And then, of course, there's a cloth that was known as the mandilion, not made by human hands. Sorry, not made by not made by human hands, implying that there was this cloth with the image of Jesus on it that was not an artwork of any kind. And that was mentioned in, I think, the 8th or 9th century. So we do have clues to it. And of course, up until about the 13th century or 14th century is when it comes into documented history, and we have pretty much an unbroken chain of custody since. So, and I'm not the best at the history, I must admit. So that's always the hardest questions for me to answer, because remember this, being the editor of Shroud.com, when I have a history question, I can pick up the phone and call a historian and get a real answer from somebody who knows what they're talking about. So, I mean, I've learned the basics of it, but it's one of the kind of the weaker points of my expertise, which is why I typically defer those questions to somebody more skilled, knowledgeable in that area.
So
but the radiocarbon dating is the question. So
yes, that was what I was going to ask you right now. After
Sure.
1988, we are 32 years later now, and how sure is it that the radiocarbon dating from 1988 is incorrect?
How sure is it? There are now
or not accurate?
Not accurate is probably a more fair determination, but there are now 4 peer-reviewed journal scientific articles in credible journals that dispute the radiocarbon dating, not based on anything wrong with the carbon dating process, but only the choice of one single piece from one corner that was used to date that cloth. There are a long history of repairs that have been made to that cloth. And my good friend Joe Marino and Sue Benford, his wonderful wife, may she rest in peace, they came up with basically what they did was they took photographs of the carbon dating samples to textile experts to get their opinions, didn't tell them it was from the Shroud, and asked their opinion. And they went through several textile experts. The first 2 they went to both said the same thing. There's evidence of manipulation in that sample site. In other words, somebody had manipulated the fibers there as if they were rewoven or repaired. And so that in itself, when they presented that theory at a conference in 2000, I was shocked, because for years, for at least 12 years, there were all these wild theories of what went wrong with the carbon dating. The process was wrong. The labs were wrong. Not true. What happened was this. There was a protocol meeting set by and attended by 7 laboratories and some additional folks, including the archaeologist Bill Meacham, who was not permitted to participate because he didn't represent a carbon dating lab, but had spent years carbon dating Chinese artifacts because he lives in Hong Kong and worked as an archaeologist in Hong Kong. And so all of this radiocarbon dating that was done in 88, they ignored their own protocols. They developed at that meeting a protocol that said, first of all, we'll do chemical analysis of the samples before they're destroyed, because in the radiocarbon dating process, they burn it until it's nothing but gas, and then they capture that gas, and that's where they do their measurements from. That's the C14 dating process, AMS. And so the radiocarbon dating labs did not choose the samples. They also were supposed to not be talking to each other, and it was supposed to be a blind study. Well, after the fact, we found out that they continued to talk to each other throughout the entire process, which was a violation of their own protocol. They did not do the chemical analysis that was called for in their own protocol. And the reason they gave for that was, well, when we opened the samples, there was only one that had that herringbone weave, distinctive of the Shroud. And so we knew which sample came from the Shroud, so we didn't feel the need to do the chemical analysis. I'm not sure how that disqualified a chemical analysis as not being important, but that was done. So they dated it. They violated all their own protocols. They took only one sample from one corner and claimed a 95% certainty of that test. Now, the three labs, if you look at the three labs, they did not agree precisely with each other. There was a range of dates that happened to travel along the little strip that was cut for dating. And at one end of the strip, you get one date, and the other end, you get a different date, considerable different date. So there's something anomalous about that little strip that was cut for dating. And now, after that occurred, the results were leaked in advance. They were supposed to be released only in a peer-reviewed journal, but it was leaked to the press before it ever got published. And then we found out that you have to understand there were three labs. They did not choose the samples or cut them. They were handed the samples in sealed containers. So the labs didn't pick the sample site. The samples were delivered to these labs, and they did their dating. And as the results were kind of released early, kind of to the press, Shroud is a fake, the three labs were supervised by a man named Dr. Michael Tite. He was the chief scientist, chief researcher at the British Museum, very prestigious position, a very prestigious scientist at a very prestigious organization. As soon as the actual dating results were released, Oxford received £1 million sterling, about $2.5 million US dollars, 1988 dollars. And Dr. Michael Tite left the British Museum and took a permanent chair at Oxford with some of that money. So that's not a real clean thing, in my opinion. That's kind of suspicious. And then to make it even worse, for 27 years after the dating, none of the labs would release their raw data. Now, historically, not always, but in general, once your paper is published and other researchers want to perhaps repeat your experiment, which is how science works, most of the time you'd be willing to release your raw data. They refused for 27 years. It wasn't until, I think, 2018, 2017 that a French researcher who also happens to be a law student and a student of the Shroud, Tristan Casabianca, went to England and used the Freedom of Information Act and forced the British Museum to release the raw data. He then went and got Emanuele Marinelli, a well-known Shroud scholar, Italian from Rome, and two other scientists that were experts in analyzing statistical data. And they re-evaluated all this data, and they determined that based on the sample that was chosen and the results given in their raw data, there is no way that that sample could be used to accurately date anywhere else on that cloth. So the radiocarbon dating, for all practical purposes, needs to be set aside. Now, of course, that's what all the skeptics have to hang on to. So obviously, they're going to deny all this. But we're talking 4 peer-reviewed journaled articles challenging that based on the anomalous nature of the sample that was chosen, the single sample, sadly, that was chosen. Now, Joe Marino, who I mentioned, who sort of started the ball rolling on this, and I should have mentioned that after 2 local textile experts told him they saw something manipulated in them, he and Sue decided to go to the horse's mouth, the best textile experts in the world. That's Thomas Ferguson Irish Linen in Ireland. And their top researcher, a woman, looked at it, and I believe she was the one who mentioned invisible reweaving, which none of us had ever heard of because it was pretty much kept a secret. It was it was perfected in the French court. So it was a very expensive proposition, not meant for mere mortals. You know, it's good to be the king. I think Mel Brooks said that. But so that particular technique was used. There's a long history of many repairs done to the shroud. There's a history that the Savoy family would cut pieces from the corners, which they did, and they would use those and sew them into copies that they authorized to be made by artists of the shroud. They would often lay that copy onto the shroud to sanctify it, make it a relic, and consequently, maybe some particles of pigment might have gotten on the shroud from that. But at the same time, those things that were pieces that were cut out were sewn into the corners of the copies to make them relics.
Very
So,
interesting. I've seen one of these relics, and it is very well made. And they notified that it is a copy of the shroud. That's
exactly.
interesting.
Extractum descendere, I think in Latin
Yeah.
it says right on them.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
And I saw one in Porto, in Portugal, at the museum. They have a copy that someone about 100 years ago washed. They washed it. And so the image is almost invisible, but in each corner is a little piece of the Shroud of Turin. And you
Wow,
can see from the
interesting.
So they showed that to me. They were somewhat embarrassed, but the person who washed it did it 100 years ago. So, there's nobody to fault. But so I've seen these copies. I've seen several of them, and they were authorized by the owners of the shroud, the Savoy family that owned it for over 500 years. And so the radiocarbon dating, had it been done properly, might have closed the book on the shroud, or it might have opened the doors wide. We'll probably not know until another carbon dating is permitted, and I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. So I guess we're going to be left with, you can believe the one paper that says it's a fake, or 4 who say that the labs didn't get it wrong, they didn't make a mistake, so nobody's blaming the labs. They're just saying that the choice of a single sample was the problem. Now, think about this. When the first paper came out challenging the radiocarbon dating, was written by Ray Rogers, the chemist on our team from Los Alamos National Laboratory. His was the first peer-reviewed journaled article challenging the carbon dating. That was the perfect opportunity for the 3 labs to say, see, it wasn't our fault. We didn't pick the sample. They just gave it to us and we tested what they gave us. It would have exonerated them. Why did they remain silent? They remained silent because they didn't want any scrutiny of what they did, because the scrutiny would show they violated all their own protocols right from the beginning. And so they rather say nothing than open the door and reveal what they did. Well, unfortunately for them, the facts are now out. We know what happened. As a matter of fact, I mentioned Joe Marino. He's got a new book that's about to come out now. I'm going to get the title here. It's a long title, and I want to give it correctly, so bear with me. It's called The 1988 C14 Dating of the Shroud of Turin, A Stunning Expose. This book by Joe should come out October, November, toward the end of the year. Obviously, we'll make a link to it from shroud.com once it becomes available. That book, about 600 pages, is going to become the definitive reference of what took place during the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud in 1988. And I would strongly urge anybody who's really into it, because this isn't going to be an easy read. This is more of a kind of a resource rather than just a narrative. But anybody who's really sincerely interested, this book is going to reveal everything that happened behind the scenes that has remained clouded in sort of mystery for the longest time. But the evidence is now there. We have all the data, and Joe has compiled this over the last few years into this massive book that hopefully will provide researchers, scholars, with a great resource of information as to what happened during the carbon dating.
So, Barry, there are 2 images actually on the shroud. One is on the front side, and then there is a parallel image on the back side of the shroud. Can you tell me a little bit more details about that?
Well, are you talking about on the reverse of the cloth?
Yes,
backside
yes, on the reverse.
Yeah, I'm not convinced there's an image there at all. The Turin authorities who are responsible for the shroud, the Turin Centro, the International Center for the Study of the Shroud, they say there's no image on the back. I don't see an image on the back, but some people see an image on the back.
I see.
You know, like Ray Rogers used to lecture me, he would say, I think I see is not a scientific statement. And so there's no definitive evidence for an image on the back, perhaps a little discoloration around the hair and beard. but nowhere else. There's no body image. And, but, you know, one or two researchers do make a claim for that. But I don't think that's widely accepted, and particularly because the authorities in Turin, they look, if there was an image on the back, why would they wouldn't have no reason to deny that. And they've had access to see the back way better than the rest of us. And there are now photographs of the reverse side of the cloth. And except for around the hair, there's a discoloration that may well be something bleeding through from the front, from the hair areas, but nowhere else.
I see. I think it was recently that an Italian guy, he tried to reproduce the shroud with very deplorable results, actually. But it is very often mentioned, oh, the shroud has been demonstrated that it's a fake, and then they reference to this guy. And I always laugh because his result is so poor and so far from.
It's
from
like a cartoon. It looks like a cartoon compared to the shroud. Look, there have been multiple efforts to duplicate the shroud. And I always say, look, making something that looks like the shroud, not that difficult because there are many images on the internet you can use as a reference. And the man you're referring to is Luigi Garlaschelli. And Garlaschelli used my photographs that I sent him. And his results still look like a cartoon. Yeah. And so, look, making something that looks like the shroud, not difficult, not modern, not in this modern world that we live in today. Making something with the same chemical and physical properties, on the other hand, no one has even come close. The image on the shroud resides on the top layers of the top fibers. How do you do that? And it's only a few microns deep. How do you do that? You can't do that with paint. You can't do that with photography. And you certainly can't do that with scorching. So we've eliminated those. And so what we have on the shroud is different than what any of the people, and look, for the last 40 years, I promise you, I have seen and evaluated every attempt to make an image like the image on the shroud, because I have a high enough profile, they always wind up sending it to me to look at. And I always say, not even close. And there are specific properties of that image that you cannot create using photography or artworks, unless maybe you have the shroud as a reference to begin with. And there have been one or two professional artists, like a woman named Emily Craig. She was a medical illustrator for 25 years before getting her PhD in forensic anthropology. And she created an image using red iron oxide dust. And she understood the depth information on the shroud and was able to incorporate a little bit of that into her result. But she used red iron oxide. And when you looked at her final result, she captured a little bit of that. But when you looked at it microscopically, it was covered with red iron oxide particles. We didn't see that on the shroud. That's not what's on the shroud. So that's not how the image on the shroud was formed. So even somebody as skilled as Emily Craig could not create an image with these same properties. And look, I've had people say, well, we'll give you $1 million if you can make an image like the shroud. And I said, well, put the $1 million on the desk and I'll just push it back, because there's no way that I have any clue how to make an image like that. Not at all.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, there is also other critics which say that the autonomy, the proportions of the arms, for example, or the hand is far different, or it should be different. What would you say to these critics?
Well, I would point them to a paper that's published on shroud.com, written by Giulio Fanti and Emanuela Marinelli, two well-known shroud scholars. It's an anthropometric study of the image on the man of the shroud, where they measured the arm length bones, the long bones of the body, and compared those to anthropology tables used by anthropologists to identify where in the world somebody might come from. And so they did this anthropometric study, and ironically, the results that they achieved were that this matches a Semitic male. Well, I knew that the first time I looked at it. The man looks like my grandfather. So I knew that it looks like a Semitic male. And that's what the anthropology people have determined. So, this whole idea, you have to remember, this is not a photograph. This isn't a picture of the man. This is an image created by the distance between the cloth and the body. So where the cloth physically touched the body, the image is darkest. And as the distance increased, the image grows more faint, up to about 4 centimeters, and that's it. And the best example of that, if you look at a black and white, one of the photos of the shroud as it would look like on a negative with a dark background, look at the hands and notice around the hands. Remember, the hands are lifting the cloth away from the torso below them. And if you look at the hands, you'll see a halo around the hand area where the cloth was lifted away from the torso, and there's less image of the torso around the hands. And it's 360 degrees around. It's not a shadow. It's not made by white light or reflected light. It's made by distance. Now, that's something that we've proven scientifically. This isn't something we're making up. So there was some interaction between the cloth and the body, but we don't know of a mechanism right now. And you remember, our team went there to answer one question: how's the image formed? We came back not able to tell you how it was. We could tell you what it's not a painting, not a photograph, not a scorch, but we know of no mechanism that can make an image with those chemical and physical properties, and that's true to this day.
So there is also many questions about the physiognomy of the man on the shroud. Is he really from a Jewish man from the 1st century?
Well, that's what that anthropometric study said, that he was. And that was based on the measurement of the long bones, the arms, the legs, and whatever other, it's not my field of expertise. So I'm sure there are other standards that it had to match. But that study is available. It's on shroud.com. And so one can read it and you can see what they determined based on, and that's a scientific study.
Wonderful. I don't see many people here on the chat. If someone has a question or so, then we can use that time. Has someone a question to Barrie?
Well, let me ask you a question. Your English is superb. Okay. So I thought in Brazil people spoke what, Portuguese?
Yes, correct? But I am Swiss Italian. I'm not Brazilian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, I know a lot of people from Brazil who speak fluent Italian as well. I've met many Brazilianos who speak Italian in Italy.
Yes.
So,
I'm 24 years here in Brazil living now. So, but my first language is German and Italian. So.
Sehr gut.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Barrie, I think you have answered my major questions in obviously in a very detailed and in-depth manner, because you have all this decades-long expertise on the subject. I don't see any questions, but there is someone that I told you about, which I wrote you that he would be interested to have a debate. He is an atheist, a skeptic on the shroud.
Yeah, and let me tell your audience how I responded to that. I have no interest in debating or entering the debate between atheism and religion. I have no interest in that. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. My parents were both born in Poland. My grandparents lived with us. It was like Fiddler on the Roof in our house. And I was raised that God was part of everything. And so I've always been a man of faith, although I walked away from organized religion when I was 13. I saw hypocrisy. I have now seen it in all major religions. So I think that's inherent in human nature, perhaps. But my faith is in God. And so I personally believe that from my point of view, look, I had walked away from religion. God wasn't a part of my life for 50 years of my life. It wasn't until my 50s, once I became more public about the shroud, that's when people started asking me, well, what do you believe? Well, I didn't have an answer. And I had looked, I mean, my Catholic friends are jealous. I've been to a mass at the Holy Sepulchre, at Peter the Fisherman's house, at in Nazareth, in Bethlehem. I mean, I've been to all these places sort of looking to see if something made me feel connected. And nothing did. And so one day, because my goal in dealing with the shroud is to answer people honestly and to tell the truth. And so I wanted to give an honest answer of what I believed, but I didn't know what I believed. And one day I sat myself down and finally I looked within myself for the first time as an adult. And I found God had been there all along, just waiting for me to acknowledge him. So I'm a person of faith. How many Jews can say it was the Shroud of Turin that brought them back to their faith in God? I can say that. And so from my perspective, if someone's an atheist, that's their choice. Look, Jesus himself said the kingdom of God is within us. So the answer to God isn't out there somewhere. It's right in here. And for me, I made that connection later in life, but I made that connection. And it brought me back to faith in God. For somebody who's an atheist or an agnostic, I respect people's point of view, whatever that might be. I don't need to argue the point. I just say, look, that's between you and God. Take it up with him. I'm not an evangelist. That's not my job. My job is simply to tell the truth about the shroud and make it available and accessible to those to whom it matters. That gives all the Christians to whom the shroud is a very important object access to the same scientific materials and historic materials that ultimately convinced me the shroud was authentic. And so each person has to reach that point by themselves, and it's not my place to tell somebody how to believe or what to think. Here's the evidence, you decide. Perhaps the smartest thing I ever wrote is in the opening paragraph of shroud.com, where it says, given the facts, we believe you have to make up your own mind about this.
Yes, of course. I mean, it is surprising, Barry, how many atheists argue that Jesus was not a historical figure and doubt that he actually even existed. And I use the shroud very often to respond and say, well, demonstrate how the image on the shroud got there, and then you eventually have a case. But I think that this is the shroud is very strong evidence for the historical Jesus, besides, of course, the extra biblical references and so forth. So,
well, you know, yeah. I often speak to school children, and I walked into a classroom and the kids were age 6 to, I guess, about 12, little kids. And consequently, I was a little concerned because, you know, this is about a man who was tortured and killed in a very horrible way. And I was concerned, and I spoke to the principal before I spoke to the kids. And I said, look, the only thing that I can tell them that a 6-year-old would grasp is that whatever it tells us was done to Jesus in the Gospels is documented with forensic accuracy on the Shroud of Turin. That's a pretty powerful argument that this was a real man and that he was tortured the way he was tortured. That's been said. And so, so as far as I'm concerned, this is something for each person to regard, study, and decide for himself.
Okay, we have a question here. Is Barry afraid that if he was a Christian, that would go against the evidence that the shroud is real?
No, not at all. What it really is this. Remember, I was hesitant to be on this team. So who better than a total skeptic, a non-Christian, to 30 or 20 years later become a spokesman for the science? Look, you can't accuse me of having religious bias unless you want to accuse me of being biased against it. I was. And so, look, I serve God being exactly who I am. God put me on that team, not in spite of being a Jew, but perhaps because of it. because he knew long before I did that I would have the ability, the capacity, the skills to bring this to a broader audience 20 years afterwards. So I serve God by being who I am. And look, I'm the reason the skeptics don't want to debate with me, because historically they can't accuse me of having a Christian bias. And because of that, that kills their biggest argument. So, and that's fine with me, because I'm not interested in trying to push somebody towards any particular position. My goal is, here's the evidence, you decide. That's what I did. I had access to it. And so all I did was create a website and give everyone access to it. And now they can make up their own minds.
Wonderful. Wonderful, Barry.
So I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. It's just that it's not necessary in my heart at this point in my life to make that kind of a step. And frankly, I don't know that I ever will, but to always give hope to my viewers out there, hey, I'm not dead yet. Who knows what I'll feel tomorrow?
So do you believe that the resurrection was real, that Jesus resurrected?
Well, I'm not sure. That's me being honest again. First of all, the whole concept of resurrection comes right out of the Old Testament to begin with. So obviously, I'm not anti-resurrection. I mean, it's a Jewish concept. If you really look closely, you'll see that. So obviously, the honest answer is I don't know. It's quite possible that Jesus was resurrected, as all my Christian brothers and sisters believe. But that's not critical to my involvement with the Shroud, which is to educate people to what we know about it so that they then themselves can decide what to believe about it. That's why I don't try and convince anybody. I think maybe I haven't mentioned it, but I was confronted after one of my lectures in British Columbia in Canada. The guy came up and said, "Oh, well, that was a great lecture, but you'll never convince me." And I looked him right in the eye and said, "What makes you think I even care what you believe? That's between you and God. Take it up with him."
Okay, we have another question here, Barry.
Pareidolia. Sure. Okay, so I'm going to start this answer by quoting Ray Rogers again. He used to yell this at me. "I think I see" is not a scientific statement. Now, the human visual perception is something, as a professional photographer and video producer, I had to grasp and learn and understand, because the work I did dealt with those issues specifically, human visual perception. And the problem with the human visual perception process, what goes in the eye goes right out the back of the eye through the optic nerve directly into the brain before we see it in our brains, before we perceive it. And our brains are easily fooled. For example, our brains are hardwired to see faces. It's why a parent can pick his child out of a crowd at 100 meters, because we're hardwired. And it may have been part of our survival mechanism from, eons ago. But we're hardwired for faces. So people send me on a regular basis pictures of the back of their guitar, the beam over the pew in the church, the wood grain on their doors with faces of Jesus. And they do it on the Shroud. And the problem with doing it on the Shroud is this. When our brains are confronted with a random pattern of shapes, and when somebody's using the high contrast black and white image of the Shroud with the weave of the cloth that's part of the landscape, so to speak, our brains are looking at all these shapes, and without any intention on our part, the brain starts comparing it to what's in our pattern memories. And the minute it sees something that's a familiar like shape in that mass of information, that's what they see. So it might be Donald Duck and you might see Mickey Mouse. But the point is, our brains do that. And that's why optical illusions work. And that's why people who do imaging work use instruments. And if you look at the people who analyze satellite or aerial reconnaissance photographs, they're called photo interpreters. Because if they make a mistake, they could start World War III. Okay, so their analysis is critically important, and they've been trained to sort of disengage that perception limitation that we have to be able to analyze photographs without misinterpreting what they see. Unfortunately, on the shroud, especially when you blow it up and you've got all these shapes and the weave structure that's prominent in some of the earlier photographs of the shroud, you won't see that in my photos because I was asked by Don Lynn of the Jet Propulsion Lab, who was on our team. He was head of imaging on Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo. He asked me if I could light the shroud so that I would minimize the weave, because he told me that, this was, remember, 1978, their computers could remove the weave, but it would remove some data along with it. It would be much better if I could light it so the weave was not prominent. In the 1931 Henriet photos, the weave was extremely prominent. It was cross-lit. And boy, people find all kind of stuff in that. But pareidolia, the best example is the face of the man in the moon. Some people see a face. Some people don't. Is there a face on the moon? I don't think so. But people see it. And consequently, that's pareidolia. And I'll repeat Ray Rogers. I think I see is not a scientific statement. That's why we use instruments and don't just trust our eyes. And fortunately, those photo interpreter guys who are looking at those satellite images, I'm glad they've been trained properly, because we don't want them to make a mistake and, end the world. So I think that pareidolia is very common problem with the shroud. And a lot of people get their images off the internet that are much lower resolution. They may be 4th, 5th, 6th generation copies. And the quality is not good enough to be termed research quality. Just as an example, my research quality image of half the shroud is 400 megabytes. Okay. Wow. Yeah. So that's a research quality image where the detail's there. But once it's been manipulated, contrast manipulated, and then copied and copied and copied and put up on the internet in a low-res version, that's not, you can't use that for any kind of credible scientific work. Just not possible.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to make you a last question, Barry. There is some critics which say, well, in 3 Gospels, they say that the linen was an entire piece, and then in the 4th Gospel, they say they were just strips of linen. How would
I'm familiar with that.
Yes. How would you respond to that criticism?
Okay. Well, first of all, they're all right. All 4 of the Gospels are correct. He was wrapped in a linen sheet. That's the way Jews are still buried to this day. That's the way Muslims are buried, as a matter of fact, in a long linen sheet, like similar to the shroud. My father was buried in one of those. So that's not at all unusual. Why were linen strips even mentioned? Well, they were in the tomb. Why were they in the tomb? If you look at the way the shroud wrapped the body, lengthwise, with the head at one end, with the feet at one end, the head in the middle, and then the cloth draped back over the body back to the feet, if you go to move the body, what's going to happen? The cloth will just fall off. So you have to bind the body into the shroud with linen strips. But by the 1st century, for all the skeptics out there who think, oh, it must have been wrapped like a mummy, by the 1st century, even the Egyptians had stopped wrapping mummies that way. That was not something that would have been done at a Jewish burial. The strips were there. They also mentioned the second cloth that was there. So they were just kind of giving you an inventory of what was in the tomb without the body. The shroud, the sudarium, and those linen strips. But the linen strips had nothing to do with other than binding the body within the shroud itself so that it wouldn't fall off when they moved the body.
So this is actually amazing physical evidence, because so many atheists, they say, well, how much is testimony worth to you? And then they say, well, how do you know that the stories written in the Gospels, that they are true, that these testimonies are trustworthy, that it wasn't just made up? And with this kind of evidence, we have physical evidence that what is in the Bible actually is so detailed to this point that the three parts of the burial clothes, they are mentioned in the Gospels, and we have two of them.
Well, look, I would point out that there are four different Gospels written by four different people. And although there are differences, of course, there are going to be differences, many of them written many years after the events, one of the arguments skeptics use, but there's so much consistency within those Gospels that all of the major things that each of them say are very consistent with each other. There are inconsistencies, of course, but that's going to happen if you and I sat down and tried to write on the same topic. They would be different from each other, of course.
If they would be all the four exactly the same, then you would say, well, that's obviously one did copy from the other. So
exactly right. So that disarms another one of the skeptics' arguments.
Yeah.
Look, I don't mind that there are skeptics out there, and I'll tell you why. We've had skeptics right from the beginning of our work. And Dr. Walter McCrone was a skeptic. And I won't go into a lot of detail there, but he was skeptical. And that's fine. What Walter McCrone's skepticism did is it forced us to do even better work, to make sure that everything we did was proper and done carefully so that it couldn't be challenged, at least at a professional scientific level. And as long as we stuck to doing good science, we can be confident in the conclusions that we drew.
Okay, we have another question here.
Sure. Thank you for asking. Oh, that's from Joe Marino. Joe is also on the board of directors of STERA, our nonprofit. So I want a full disclosure here. The way to support Shroud.com is right on Shroud.com. Now, I always tell people when you go to Shroud.com, pack a lunch and a snack because you're going to be there for a while. And it got so big that I could not find articles that I knew I'd put there somewhere, couldn't find them. So there's now a search engine, it's been there for a long time, on Shroud.com, only searches within our website. So if you're looking for something specific about the Shroud, use the search engine on the front page of the website, and you will find what you're looking for. And look, today, by now, most of us know how to use search engines reasonably well. So anyone who wants to find something there should be able to find it using that search engine. Now, because we are a nonprofit organization, at least here in the United States, contributions that are made to us, which can be made, we have a secure contribution form accessible from the front page of the website. You can make a contribution and we send you a receipt that you can use to deduct that contribution on your income tax. I know that people in England can also deduct based on the American system, but I don't know about any other countries. So, but for those in the United States, we'll send the receipt to every person who's willing to donate to us. But in some cases, they may not get a tax advantage from it the way folks in the U.S. and the U.K. might. So that's the way to support us is by going to Shroud.com, finding our secure contribution form and helping us out, especially now during the COVID problems. All of my lecturing this year was canceled. I had 3 trips to Europe scheduled that were all canceled. I was going to be in Rome to teach my course at the university. I was going to be in Turin to meet with the folks at the museum there. And I was supposed to be in England to speak to the Muslim organization that I speak to. This would have been the 5th year in a row. And that might be a surprise for your listeners because 5 years ago in 2015, I was invited by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in England to come and speak about the Shroud. And I have to admit, I was very nervous about that because in America, we don't get any good news about Muslims. And remember, they're now asking a Jewish man to discuss a Christian relic at a Muslim convention.
Mm-hmm.
But I went. I felt this was God opening a door that I should go through. I have made friends there as good and close as any of the Christian friends that I've made or Jewish friends that I have. This is the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, not the ones we read about in the news every day. Their motto is love for all, hatred for none. So in August, the beginning of the month, this month, I was supposed to be there. But of course, they canceled the event. It's 35 to 40,000 people coming from 30 or 40 countries around the world. Would have been foolish to try and attempt to have that event this year. So it's canceled until next year, God willing. And I'm looking forward to it. But I actually got up in front of everybody and said what I said a moment ago. And they cheered me for my honesty, that I was nervous to come there. They appreciated me telling the truth. And that's why my job isn't difficult. You know, if God had said, go out there and tell them any story you can to convince them, I would have failed the first day. But to go out and tell the truth, that's easy. I don't have to remember what lie I told yesterday. So that I can, yeah. So for me, look, this is a personal thing for me. And I know that it has great significance and meaning to millions of people around the world. I've always known that and respected that, even if it doesn't reflect my point of view. It doesn't matter. This isn't about me. It doesn't really matter what I believe or what I think. And that's why I say, don't take my word for any of this. All of the science is published in peer-reviewed journals and is accessible on shroud.com. And that's where you can go look at the material and decide for yourself.
That's wonderful. That's a really great thing that you are doing. And you are very privileged to have this task, this mission. And I think that you are doing a great job and a great service to not only Christianity, but other religions too.
For everybody, I hope.
Yes, yes, absolutely. There is some other comment. Let me check here. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what can I say? I believe that the Shroud is authentic. I believe it is significant to 1 billion or so people on this planet. I respect that, even if I don't have the same emotional response or attachment to it that obviously most Christians would have. That doesn't take away any of its meaning. Don't forget, that's a Jewish burial shroud of a Jewish man. So put aside all the religious aspects for a minute. Let's just be humans for a moment. How can one not be impacted by what this man suffered for saying and speaking out what he believed in? How can you not have empathy for that person? Whether he's a Christian, a Jew, it doesn't matter. He's a human being, and he suffered a horrible death for something he believed in so much that he was willing to sacrifice himself the way he did. Yeah. And so I have love for him, maybe not exactly the same way as a Christian would, but just as a human being, for someone whose impact is being felt more than any other human who's ever lived 2,000 years after his death.
Yeah.
So I can see that. I agree with Mike on that one. I agree, Mike. I mean, look, I didn't rush into this. Hey, when that day comes, you'll know that I'll take the right choice, okay?
Okay, Barry, it was very entertaining, very informative, and I hope that our audience also enjoyed our talk. It was a great pleasure to have you at my channel, and I hope we can keep in touch and keep sharing information. And who knows, if you have some other news that come up, then it would be a great pleasure to have you again here.
I would be happy to do it again at whenever you ask. As you saw, it's not difficult. People say, what does it take to get you to come and speak? Ask.
Yeah.
No, this is what I do, and I'm grateful for it. And so all I can say to you, my friend, is grazie mille.
Va bene, anche io ringrazio molto per la partecipazione e spero che ci vediamo un'altra volta.
Grazie.
Okay. Thank you for the audience to be with us. And
have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, have a nice weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.